Hello everyone, I'm Matt, and I build small plastic robots. But this one's pretty big. Today I'm going to be looking at the 1/144th scale Real Grade Hi-Nu Gundam by Bandai, taken from the novel Mobile Suit Gundam Belter Chica's Children. Although similar to its namesake, the iconic RX-93 Nu Gundam, the Hi-Nu dials much of that suit's characteristics up to 11, complete with dual fin funnel wings and much bulkier proportions. It also has a unique colour scheme more evocative of the classic Gundam blue. This kit was released in 2021, long after the Real Grade line's emphasis on the advanced MS joint system had decreased. In the case of this kit, the MS joint runner is completely separate from the main suit, instead serving as the joints for the 6 fin funnels included. Despite this, a full inner frame is still mostly possible. It now builds up more like a master grade instead, with heavy layering of pieces. Otherwise, staples of the Real Grade line remain from even the oldest kits, including a large sheet of decals, complete with chrome-like finishes, and dynamic separation of armour when the kit is articulated. Another interesting detail on this kit is the colour separation. There's much less emphasis on multiple shades of a plastic colour. For instance, the white on this kit seems uniform across the suit, although there are 2 shades of blue on the fin funnels. Instead, focus is given to realising such a complex and layered suit, with no need for painting by the builder, complete with silver and gold plastic in the box. Whilst the silver plastic has a nice finish that's neither too shiny nor too flat, I feel the gold plastic in the box isn't as successful, and as I'll show later on, my gold Gundam marker got quite a workout on this build. I was disappointed to learn that unlike the Zaku 2, each phase of the instructions doesn't list the runners required for the part being built. It's a small issue, but I feel like it reduces the amount of runner jumping required, and therefore simplifies the build process to a degree. Starting with the head, I immediately ran into my first problem. For whatever reason, I just couldn't get the eye sticker to look right. When I fully assembled the head, it always looked slightly off, like one eye was too high, and I found the sticker didn't adhere to the raised eyepiece well either. I have to wonder whether this may be due to the thinner material of Real Grade decals. More realistically, I'm probably just a bit too perfectionist at these things. In the end, I chose to paint the eyes instead. I used a black Gundam marker to coat the eyepiece entirely, and then brushed on the paint from my golden Gundam marker using a fine miniature brush. After making sure both sides were equal and inside the boards of each raised eyepiece, I waited for it to dry before applying a small coat of Games Workshop's hard coat varnish to protect the paint and increase the shine on the eyes. The build of the torso more or less flew by. It's really simple in how each piece layers and connects, but it does contain some rather eye-opening and much appreciated complexities in its build, such as the exceptional ab crunch. This area also reintroduced the Real Grade staple I wasn't aware still appeared in later kits, using chrome style decals on the inner frame joints. As with the Zaku 2, some of the decal placement on this kit's a bit of a head scratcher, especially those inside the waist, but they do add that extra dimension and metal-like finish to the kit, and I think they are used a bit more sensibly here versus the Zaku 2. Although at this point the kit felt very solid and easy to manipulate, I would caution about the cockpit area. The whole thing's held on by a rather small C-clip, and I found it rather easy to simply pull the entire section off when trying to use the ab crunch. The arms and the shoulders are just as impressive. At first, they felt almost light on parts for a Real Grade, but despite that, you get a full internal frame and an unrivaled amount of movement in the arm. Another gimmick's on display here as well, and it's a really cool hinged wrist that, when moved, reveals more of the right arm's integrated gun. It's not unlike the common piston gimmick seen in many master grades, and indeed in this kit later on. There's also perfect grade style hatches and opening areas present in the shoulders, and it highlights some really impressive detail underneath, really selling that scale model of a real machine nature of Gunpla itself. The waist area on the kit is staggeringly complex, especially when compared to the likes of older Real Grades. The front skirts and side skirts are connected together via an intuitive and secure pair of joints. I'm happy to report there won't be any front skirts going missing this time. As mentioned, there's some rather hard to see, but still rather nice chrome decals inside the hips, which can also drop down to aid articulation. The back skirts, while not as posable, do have some nice part separation as well. With the upper body now completed, it was on to the legs, and I don't think there's enough superlatives to describe how much fun they were. As with the arms, there's numerous small features and gimmicks, some of which are front and centre and others barely visible on the fully constructed limbs. Falling into the latter category are the pistons inside the legs. Unusually for a Gundam kit, or at least one I've built, the pistons are not in the ankles above the feet, but inside the knee joint, with the knee bend not only moving the upper leg armour, but the pistons inside too. Whilst I would have liked the classic lower leg pistons to be present as well, I love seeing these gimmicks come together, and highlighting these inner mechanics once again reinforces the real nature of the kit. Likewise, this kit may possess the most complicated pair of feet I've ever built on a Gundam, with plenty of pieces to snap together and great articulation, on par with the rest of the kit. Some parts of the leg build can feel a bit like a balancing act at times. There's a piece that the back of the calves clips into, that presses into a sliding joint inside the leg. On the first leg I built, it seemed to be a little loose, and if I moved it slightly, it'd drop out of position easily. On the second leg it stayed in the groove rather securely however, and with the leg fully assembled, both feel solid enough in motion. I did find it took a few tries to line up the booster fins behind the ankle too. It does briefly feel quite resistant to going in the slots, but this does at least mean it's secured properly when it's in place. The white piece housing the booster had its own visually infuriating issue, a very uneven and very unpleasant mould line on either side. More often than not, I find mould lines either out of the way or minimal enough in appearance that I don't feel the need to clean them up. These ones were way too glaring to ignore though, so out came the sanding sticks. Although the removal wasn't particularly flawless, especially given my previous inexperience in removing them, I'm glad I gave it a go as the end results look a lot better. With the main mobile suit built, and already towering over most of my high grades, it was time to build the enormous winged backpack. Unfortunately, I don't feel the build of the backpack lives up to the rest of the kit, with the major exception of the wings themselves. Propellant tanks on mobile suits are in fact the best thing ever. However, the propellant tanks on this kit were quite hard to put together, because the world clearly hates me. Much like the booster housing earlier, they have an almighty mould line running across them, which took a fair bit of effort to reduce in severity. With the tanks being complete cylinders, it also meant sanding them without creating flat areas was quite difficult. Whilst I made do with the sanding sticks here, for a more professional result I would probably recommend using a proper set of sandpapers, as the paper can then be simply wrapped around the tanks and rotated for a more even finish. Although my own initial attempt to remove the mould line using just my craft knife didn't have much effect, a more patient approach, or even a dedicated mould line remover like Games Workshop sell, might be able to do the trick a bit better. The other issue I had with the tank was how the rear piece connects. The parts don't sit very flush, and though I'm conscious this was probably an intentional design choice, to me it does look a little odd, as though the parts aren't fully pushed together. The backpack itself is otherwise quite simple, with a clip for the hyper bazooka that does feel a little easy to yank out by accident. Of course, the wings are the main event here, and they snap into the backpack nice and tight, allowing for a full swivel and upwards tilt. Inside, there's left and right movement for each wing connector, and the outermost connector is linked into the booster. When tilted outwards, the booster will move in tandem, much like the shifting armour and pistons in the legs. As with those features, this area of the build felt really rewarding, and even without the fin funnels, the wings add a lot to the suit's silhouette. When detached, the backpack could also pass for an 80s arcade game spaceship, which is always a bonus in my book. The fin funnels are definitely a time. Building 6 of the same thing gets a little dull, and it wasn't helped by some fitting issues I suffered when building the first half of the wings. I think this may have been down to the undergating. Insufficient cleanup on undergated parts can lead to things not sitting quite as flush due to it being on the underside of the part. With that said, I sanded the underside of each part slightly to see whether it would remedy the issue, and whilst it did sit a little closer to the piece, the white segments still lifted away from the back. Ultimately, I chose to glue these pieces down to ensure a proper fit. It would have been better if I didn't have to of course, but it's a quick job and it put my mind at rest. I should note I had no issues with fitting on the other halves of the funnels, so that was a relief. The finished funnels also feel really strong. The instructions do caution against handling the parts too heavily in case of breakage, but they feel like they'll hold up a bit better than the MS joints of old. Finally, it was onto the weapons, and as with the backpack, it's something of a mixed bag. The shield's absolutely on the high end of the spectrum though, with spot on colour separation and plenty of detail as you'd expect. Although the connection piece is quite simple, It feels solid, and I found a surprising amount of motion from a single ball joint. The beam rifle is also quite nicely designed, with a good amount of detail. However, I felt the E-pack on the bottom of the rifle could have been colour separated for a little more visual interest. I did initially attempt to paint this myself using the standard grey Gundam marker. What I hadn't realised was that said marker is essentially one-to-one with the grey plastic of the kit, so the results made the endeavour a bit pointless. A further attempt with my black marker didn't go very well either, so I had to turn to the world's favourite purple liquid that isn't Vimto. Methylated spirit. I decided to just leave the part as is, and with the weapon fully assembled and panel lined, it doesn't stick out anywhere near as much anyway. The main disappointment came in the form of the Hyper Bazooka. The back of the weapon is cast in the same metallic style silver plastic seen throughout the kit, but on the wider surface of this piece, the plastic doesn't look quite right, and I think it overall cheapens the look of the weapon. With that in mind, I took the silver Gundam marker out for another spin. It's generally agreed that painting large areas with Gundam marker isn't advisable, as the final appearance can be a little patchy or uneven. This has generally rung true for me when using my markers, but for some reason I find the metallic markers much more capable of covering large areas. In the case of these pieces, I did have to do a couple of touch-ups, as some areas dried with patches of bare plastic visible. On the whole, however, I think it looks a lot nicer to the eye than the original finish, and since I retained the rest of the silver plastic on the weapon, it does add a little more colour separation. With the entire kit now assembled, it was time to panel line, and seeing how this kit has less in terms of separation via shades of plastic, I feel it becomes a bit more necessary on this kit than the other real grades. As usual, I went with grey for the white and light blue areas, and I chose black for the dark blue segments in order to provide a greater contrast that highlighted those details more. With my main grey Gundam marker out of action, I used the Unipin grey fine liner with a 0.1 nib size. Although not quite small enough to fill some lines fully, this pen is excellent for filling edges, and it highlights areas visibly without being overwhelming in most cases. If a line does come out a bit too thick in some areas, I'd advise lightly brushing the area with a plastic eraser. I always try to soften the line without being heavy enough to completely remove the ink, but this can take some practice to get right. As mentioned throughout, I painted a fair bit of this kit with silver and gold Gundam marker. I used the silver to paint in the inner vents throughout the suit. Whilst realistically these probably wouldn't look so pristine, I think it highlights the detail in these areas slightly more, drawing attention to segments of the mobile suit that are less visually distinctive or masked by armour plating. I also used the silver on the head Vulcans and on the vortex generators on the chest. This was inspired by the metallic finish on the Zeta and Double Zeta Vercar model kits. As I hinted at the beginning of the build, all the gold plastic on this kit was painted with Gundam marker for a shinier and more premium finish. I also painted some smaller details and the outer vents of the suit. The smaller details were painted to create more overall visual interest, but I painted the vents for a more cohesive appearance by matching them to those found in the legs. Although it does initially come out thicker than the silver marker, I usually find the gold marker produces similar excellent results, with a very authentic, rather brass-like finish. I would suggest taking a good while before handling any painted pieces however. I've noticed the gold does take a fair bit longer to dry than my silver marker, sometimes taking up to half an hour to 45 minutes to be touch dry. The gold Gundam marker is somewhat hard to control on smaller areas as well, so I ended up filling some vents with solid gold. This did create a somewhat flatter look, and to restore the three-dimensional appearance, I broke out probably Games Workshop's most iconic shade paint, Agrax Earth Shade, one of those small pots of joy I couldn't live without. I applied a rather generous helping to each vent, making sure there was enough to cover the vents without flooding the part. I was quite thrilled with the end results. I wasn't entirely sure how applying the shade paint over a Gundam marker would turn out, but it more or less achieved the exact results I'd been hoping for. The final step of the build was applying the decals to the model. Like the Zaku, the sheet is rather large and varied, but I feel the kit is overall far more conservative with decal placement, and for once I actually used most of them. While some areas are very light on decals compared to others, what you do receive is more than sufficient for creating that real grade look. Like the Zaku, I found the decals reasonable to work with, and with the right approach to applying them, you'll achieve excellent results. Although many of the decals are cut to the surface they're applied to, I did find a few ended up overhanging, with others going over raised details to mixed results. In the case of overhanging decals, I simply pressed the decals over the edge of the part and removed the excess area using my craft knife. If you try this, make sure to use a very sharp blade for a cleaner cut, and to cut a few times if necessary to completely separate the overhang from the rest of the decal. I did this in a few places, most visibly on the upper front skirts and on some small details on the shoulders. My final piece of advice before wrapping up the build is to apply stickers over a clean, flat surface. This is because I applied most of mine close to my face, over a carpeted floor. A lot of these decals, and especially the metallic ones, are microscopic in size, and sure enough, one of the small squares intended for the feet flew off, never to be seen again. To create a similar effect, I used a silver Gundam marker once more. Sadly, it's not quite as chromed out as it should be, but it'll do the job. Even though they are very small, I do feel these smaller decals still add to the kit's final appearance, and I'd highly recommend using them, even if you pick up the official water slide decals produced for the kit. And that wraps up the build, so here's the finished Hi-Nu Gundam in all its glory. I love how this suit takes a lot of visual elements from different Gundams, from the Zeta-like back fin to the arm gun that emulates the NT1 Alex, and combines them into an almost definitive singular design that will stand out on the shelf. It also stands out in terms of size. When compared to the 1/144 scale RX-78-2, the Hi-Nu is a towering presence. And whilst the entry grade Nu Gundam rivals it for height, the increased wingspan and detail of the Hi-Nu creates a far more imposing mobile suit. As far as my collection goes, only the Psy Gundam from Mobile Suit Gundam Hathaway is bigger than the Hi-Nu. Although again, the Hi-Nu is packed with far more detail and decals out of the box, with the decals on the Psy Gundam here taken from the sold separately Gundam decal set. One thing that did surprise me with the finished kit is how hard I found getting it posed. This isn't much to do with the kit however, with the amount of joints on offer you can essentially get any pose you'd want. I did find manipulating each part a bit of an exercise though, and certain areas like the shoulders do tend to wiggle off the pegs with a bit of effort. For best results, I'd highly advise a display stand. The kit includes a rather unusual base adapter designed for Bandai's own action bases, but it does require a particular adapter peg from those bases, and all mine were either missing in action or being used on my Witch from Mercury display, so I had to make do with the generic pincer connector. This kit will look awesome propped up in mid-air, especially with those massive wings, and the amount of expression from both the articulation and detail of the build will have you posing it for hours. Besides the aforementioned shoulders, I also found the kit extremely solid, capable of holding most of its poses with nothing feeling especially loose or weak. Overall, the Real Grade Hi-Nu Gundam really is a standard bearer for Gunpla, and you'll be glued to your building desk for hours putting it together. Besides some odd fitting issues and slightly underwhelming attributes like the propellant tanks, the kit is a real joy to handle, and simply looking at the thing's enough to inspire. Putting it together manages to be complex in its parts count and mechanics, yet straightforward and satisfying to snap together for a massively rewarding result. If you see this guy in the shops, even if you're relatively new to the hobby, I'd recommend you pick him up there and then. It's definitely not a kit you want to look past. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video as much as I did building the kit, and as with last time, pop any questions or advice in the comments and I'll get back to you. Right now I'm building the channel's first high grade, the rather out there Atlas Gundam from Mobile Suit Gundam Thunderbolt, and I'll hopefully be able to share it soon once I've gotten through painting all the yellow. Take care everyone, and see you next time.